Welcome to Modern Financial Wellness, the podcast dedicated to helping you feel better about your finances. I'm your host, Jim Grace, and I'll be your guide as we discuss the psychology of money and explore the emotional aspects that shape our financial decisions and how we feel about them. A quick note before we start, although I do hope that you find the information on this show to be helpful, in no way are any of these discussions to be taken as specific financial advice. Please do your own research and talk to your own advisors, especially when making important financial decisions. All right. The author is Manisha Thakor. The book is Money Zen, The Secret to Finding Your Enough. Thank you so much for joining us on Modern Financial Wellness. It's great to have you here with us today.
Jim, thank you so much for inviting me.
So I'm not just trying to flatter you, but I was really excited to talk to you because I just think there's so much in your book. And with this topic of enough and what that means, I really think it's one of the more important topics in personal finance or just overall wellness in general right now. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the book. And I guess the first question I wanted to ask, if you're open to maybe sharing a little bit about your own journey, which you do a great job, laying out your own experience. This isn't something that you've researched and wrote a book about. You've been experiencing this and kind of come full circle on your own journey. So would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how did you find yourself a workaholic deep into your career as a starting point for our conversation?
I am 53 years old right now, and the roots of my workaholism stem back to fourth grade when I was bullied. The kids called me a lot of mean names from fourth to sixth grade, everything from cow butt and thunder thighs to mustache mouth. And Indian women, when they hit puberty, oftentimes start to grow some hair on their upper lips. And those 3 years, which seemingly are small events in the grand scope of things, put me on this path because I felt rejected so much by my peers that I threw myself into academics where I felt accepted by my teachers, which then as I moved into the work world, what replaces grades and teachers' approval, but money and promotions. And so what started off as a probably healthy defense mechanism for a young person ended up becoming so toxic that I woke up in my 50s very ill for the second time. And with the recognition that while I had developed financial health, I had done it at the cost of, I was emotionally bankrupt and I was a human doing and not a human being. And so that's the arc.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm glad that you focused on your own journey in your childhood specifically, and you label those as traumas, small t traumas that you experienced as a young adult. And I think it's important to highlight because I think when we hear about childhood trauma, we think of the abused child that becomes a drug addict. But there's lots of different variations to traumatic experiences, and they don't have to be physical or sexual abuse. And the outcome doesn't need to be what society might label as, again, drug addicts or, some of these other, situations that we can get in as an adult. It could be, childhood bullying, kids being mean, and we kind of absorb that and internalize it. And we show up as an adult still kind of carrying around some of those experiences.
Well, these are called small t traumas, things that happen to us before age 25 when our brains are fully formed. And as I was researching the book, both from a more academic side, but also collecting stories from other individuals who are struggling with enough, just to give listeners a sense, one person told me it was cultural. Coming from Jamaica, being first generation, feeling this incredible pressure that came down subtly through family. back home in Jamaica wanting her to excel. Another person told me it was a seemingly innocent event where she was sitting with her dad and her brother, and their father was teaching them something and said to her, "Oh, you don't need to learn that. You're a girl." And so, I mean, for men and women, these kinds of things can live deep within you. And many people have told me they feel very embarrassed that in their adult years, something that in retrospect as an adult, you look and you think that wasn't a big deal, but it still hurt. It's still hurting you. And the behaviors and beliefs that you developed back then to cope oftentimes continue on almost as if they were a runaway train. And in fact, that's called a runaway trait. And it can affect people very deeply.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So here you are, you end up in your professional career, and how you're behaving is really a reflection of, this past experience where you received validation and recognition, and that schoolwork and straight A's translates into promotions and bonuses, and you're just perpetuating that same behavior in just a different light.
Yes. And if I kind of go back to the very beginning of my career, I got out of undergrad. I went to go work at an investment banking firm, and then went to business school and went to work for an investment management firm. And the kind of hours that I put in, it started with my being inherently very intellectually interested in the work. I was single at the time and young and ambitious. And so I would read and do extra work on the weekends. And then, I got started being promoted, and I came up with new ideas and product lines, and I dove into building out those businesses. And next thing I knew, I was hopping off planes at 9 p.m., going into the office until 2 a.m., returning home, showering, and being back at my desk before the market opened. And, in financial services, they don't call that workaholism or having a never enough mindset. They call that being a good employee. So that's,
Right.
one of the cultural norms that really kept pushing me along that path. And the way I lived was running as hard as I could professionally until I hit a wall. Then I'd collapse, recover through copious sleep and, a mental health day or two. And then I'm right back at it. And that was my modus operandi for almost 3 decades.
Yeah.
And it had a horrible effect on my health and my relationships.
Mm-hmm. So it's, again, it's worth, opening up the conversation, I think, thinking about how we get to that point, because I think a lot of us end up in adulthood and our professional careers, and we're carrying around who we were, how we coped, how we adapted. And it's just, there's no reason to stop until you maybe get sick, and have to come to kind of a hard place of where you go from there, right? It's almost like a crash and burn type of situation eventually for a lot of folks.
And that's a big part of the reason that I wrote this book, because the most common reasons that people hit this point is health, or they come into a situation where perhaps they're grappling with the sandwich generation, elder care now impeding the ability to both work and take care of kids, and something like that just stops them in their tracks. And my hope is that by sharing my story, but not just my story, the stories of so many others that were willing to be candid and raw, would help anybody who feels either that no matter how much they earn, how many achievements they accomplish, no matter how much praise they receive, it's just never enough, because the finish line keeps moving forward. Or alternatively, anyone who feels like they've been sucked into society's subtle pressures to believe that the answer to anything that ails us is more, earn more, do more, be more. So for individuals that identify with that mindset, they're on the path to hitting the wall the way I was, and I want to help them.
It's coming.
10 years, right, before they get there.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to me. It sounded like, and it comes through in the book, but as you just described, you seem to be curious and intellectually interested in the work. So it wasn't necessarily all bad. I think there are some folks that I've met and worked with that it's almost like a double-edged sword where they're working themselves to death and they really don't love the work. They just feel like they need to make more. They never have enough. So there's all these different variations or kind of combinations of people trying to find their not enough and whether or not they're into or passionate about the work. And no one teaches you about any of this stuff. So I agree. It's timely. And I think people are talking about meaning and purpose and importance more and more, but I didn't have that course in college. It wasn't part of the, guidance counselor conversation in high school about where I'm, which university you're going to and thinking about these things. So it's really great that people like you are putting this work and this content out into the world so that hopefully people pick it up before they hit the wall.
Well, you bring up a really interesting issue that I've been asked a lot as I've been talking about the book, which is, what if you love your work, but you know that it's causing friction in your personal life and perhaps keeping you from achieving what you want professionally because you're running around like a whirling dervish. And there are now academics that literally specialize in workaholism. And what I learned from them was that there is the distinction between being intellectually interested in your work and it taking over your life is the ability to disengage. So people who have a healthy engagement with their work are able to work. And then when they stop, they stop. Their minds move on to whatever it is that they are doing next. And they are not constantly living in the future around their work. And for me, I felt like I was working 24/7, 365, because even if it was a holiday or I was on vacation, my mind was going to work and frequently so were my fingers as I checked emails obsessively. But it was the fact that work just permeated my brain all the time that made it so unhealthy. And then we can talk more about this, but then the flip side of people who don't like their work, but keep doing it because they feel financially trapped, is another big one. I talk about it very early on in the book. The work I did before business school was in investment banking. And I actually left fairly early on into the program to switch to investment management. And I thought when I went in to resign that the firm that I worked for was going to be livid. They had sent me to their headquarters in London for, training and spent a lot of money investing in me. And then before I got really productive, I said I was going to leave. And I'll never forget the managing director to whom I submitted my resignation basically said, good for you, Manisha, get out of this world before your family becomes so used to this money that there's nowhere else you can earn this kind of money and you're trapped. And it's just never left my mind. And interestingly enough, two other fairly senior people said the same thing to me before I left. And I think so many people feel trapped in their work because of the earnings potential. And that kind of raises the issue of the third of four factors that I think push us into this mindset of never enough. And that's societal influences that push us to have things, do things, be certain ways that require us to do work we don't like.
Right. And that's a great segue because I wanted to talk about the world we live in today. And I think one of the really interesting concepts that you bring to light, I wanted to touch base with you, is the idea of social comparison. But you had kind of an interesting nuance or spin on it. And I think you were talking to Carl Richards, who I really like his work as well, and about this. And how you described it was, I think when people hear keeping up with the Joneses, what they think of is, well, my neighbor got a Mercedes, so now all of a sudden people look across the street and they want a Mercedes, right? They want to upgrade. But I think another important point that's maybe a little more nuanced and often not talked about is it's more of how I experience it personally and with the clients I work with. It's more of almost like a silent validation or confirmation or permission to maybe take on the home project. So for example, it's not necessarily my neighbor got a new kitchen, so I'm going to get a new kitchen. It's, well, they look a lot like me, and if they can afford it, well, maybe we can too. Maybe we can afford to take on that project and take on a little bit of debt. So it's, again, maybe it's a little bit more nuanced, and maybe I'm not articulating, but I thought that was a really interesting way to tackle social comparison and something to bring to light.
Jim, I think you've nailed it. And throughout mankind, we've compared ourselves to each other. But what's so difficult about the comparisons now is starting, let's call it 30, 40 years ago, access to credit became so much more widespread. And that enabled us to live beyond our means. And when we look at our neighbors, and our brains are subtly saying exactly that, like, well, if they can do it, I should be able to do it. Right. We don't know if they did it because they had the cash on hand, if they inherited the cash, if they earned the cash, or if it's all on, credit or a home equity, a HELOC. And so the easy ability to live beyond our means, and the cultural messaging, more broadly speaking, that debt isn't bad, combine to make a really toxic environment. And then there's another element where we used to compare ourselves horizontally to our neighbors. And I can remember growing up, there was a show called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And I remember watching that. I had no association with those people. It never occurred to me that I would have a lifestyle like that. But now we're exposed to a more of a vertical comparison. And I can talk a little bit more if you'd like about that, the where that vertical comparison comes from. But that's been another piece that is very different.
And it's interesting. Your book focuses on kind of a workaholic mentality and a focus on more wealth, right? And constantly striving and accomplishing. But in this conversation that we're having now about social comparison, the one thing that I see a lot with my clients as well is they're comparing and not feeling like they're doing enough for their kids, right? As a working mother, they're not also contributing enough to their household. And we're getting Instagram or TikTok posts about how beautifully arranged the toys are going to be. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I haven't had time to like put my socks in the laundry, let alone organize, color code all the toys in the toy room. Right. And it's coming at us from all angles. And it's a really, kind of chaotic time to try to deal with all that.
It is so pervasive. In my case, I got to a point where I literally felt my self-worth was my net worth because of my personal journey and arc. But what I found is the equation self-worth equals ? If for someone the answer to that question mark is not in alignment with who they are authentically, it causes a life of pain and disconnection. And just to give some examples, a yoga instructor told me self-worth for her was the number of students in her class, the number of private lessons that she was able to teach, and her ability to do all of that while also being a great mom of two. Another academic told me that their definition of self-worth was the number of papers published and the number of times those papers were cited in other publications. But the work that's required to do that meant that the ability to be the kind of parent that you see in social media, on TV, in movies, it makes you feel like it's never enough and you are never enough. And I think it's particularly hard on parents these days because, I can remember growing up and, my extracurricular activities were, Girl Scouts and maybe ice skating lessons, and they were once a week. And, if you didn't go, you didn't go. Today, things are so scheduled. And what's happening is as parents look at other parents and then look at, what it takes to get into college and this and that, this sheer schedule that seems to come along with being a parent is completely incompatible with working and having any time for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've experienced that during the pandemic. I think a lot of people did. And it was particularly tough in the earlier days of COVID when daycare shut down. And we had two little kids and all of a sudden there wasn't childcare. And fortunately, I run my own practice. So I got to make the decision that I have enough time to manage the current clients that I have, but I can't really grow. I can't really take anything on that's new. But I still felt like, and I think my wife feels similarly, I never really felt like a great financial advisor, financial planner, and I never really felt like a great father in a lot of those moments. And that's one extreme example of living through that. But I think there's opportunities for parents to kind of feel that way almost every day, right? Where they're just trying to get everything done, both professionally and personally, and show up as a good parent. And you mentioned the sandwich generation as a good son or daughter, and watching your parents get older. That's something we're working through right now as our parents age. It's just a lot. It's just a lot to manage. But you bring up this identity. I think that doesn't have to be, who we are as people, right? And I think sometimes we're quick to kind of attach work or labels in these roles to like who we are. And maybe that's something that we can focus on, maybe not placing so much emphasis on.
Yeah, I mean, this it's become a cultural norm that, we meet someone and within the first couple of questions, you're always asked, so what do you do? And so there is such pressure. You judge the other person and you feel they're judging you based on the answer to that question. And to think that we're valuing ourselves based on our work, that triggers ego and greed and desires to move forward, which are the one negative side. I mean, there's also the positive side. If you love your work and you feel like you're making a big difference in the world, you can feel proud of what you do. But all of these emotions get stirred up, both the healthy ones of loving your work and feeling proud of your contribution, but then also, jealousy that somebody else is doing more, better, earning more, moving up the ladder faster. And there's a gentleman named Derek Thompson who writes for The Atlantic, and he talks about this a lot. And he basically says, we've gone from jobs to careers to callings, and now we are worshiping at the altar of workism. And as opposed to getting our identities from our community, whether it's a religious community or a bowling league, a book club, being a Boy Scout den leader, our identities, we have work families. And, people even joke about having a work spouse that oftentimes you talk to more than your actual spouse. And so work has wormed its way into our very fabric of not just the way we spend our time, but our self identities.
Yeah. And I experienced that a little bit. I can vividly remember as I was reading your book and trying to think back on my own childhood and where some of my stuff comes from. I made a basketball team as a young child because I hustled. My dad said, if you work really hard at this age, if you run a lot and you try really hard, they'll put you on the team. And they did. And I remember that to this day. And through my high school, through college, athletics was a big part of my own identity. And then I got out into the working world and I didn't have that any longer. And it was a tough period of time where I can't get congratulated for my athleticism or my accomplishments. It's like a now what, right? And the natural progression is into our work, right? And it just perpetuates itself. I wanted to ask you a question because you brought this up, this question of what do you do? My wife and I were in Italy recently, and on the plane ride home, we both kind of commented that not one person asked us what we do. Are these things uniquely American? And how much so in your experience?
I will tell you, I've traveled to 36 countries. So, we've got well over 100. So I can only speak to that particular portion, but I feel like with the exception of maybe the UK, there's not another country that I've visited where this is an introductory, at least, topic of conversation. It may come up when you know someone better, but it's not the kind of question that you ask when you're first meeting someone to get to know them. The work is who they are. And I read a really interesting article in the New York Times about a gentleman who decided to host a series of small dinner parties with people who didn't know each other. And there was only one rule, which is for the first 90 minutes, you could not ask, what do you do, or talk about your work. And people found it so difficult to do.
Yeah, it's like the question after the weather, right? We're either going to talk about what we do or we're going to talk about the impending hurricane that's going to hit the East Coast this weekend, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. So it's important, I guess, the takeaways that I've had from the book and talking to you, obviously we want to understand who we are, where we come from, how we're behaving, and maybe where some of these things come from. We want to be conscious of the world around us and that, hustle culture, counterfeit financial culture, you talk about a little bit in the book, like what you see on Instagram and TikTok is very often not real life, and just focusing on the things that we can control and the things that make us happy. That's a good starting point. So we fast forward, we've gone on this 20-year plus, journey together to get to this point where we hopefully haven't hit the wall, but we've woken up and we're going to make some change and look forward. Where do we go from here? Once, if somebody's listening and they want to start to make change or maybe focus their attention on the things that are more important, like how do we step forward?
When I wrote the book, it was very much to help myself. It was an exploration of how did I screw up my life and how can I fix it? And so as I went through the process, I realized that the things that helped me were universal and can help people irrespective of income or age or profession. And so I feel like the one way to summarize the first step is to get clarity around what your self-worth equals question mark. What is that question mark? And the factors that I talk about in the first half of the book are really designed to help you dive deep and understand what that is. If this conversation is of interest to you, then most likely what's on the other side of that equal sign is not healthy. So what I'm aiming to help people do is to live their lives to optimize a new mental mindset, which I summarize as financial health plus emotional wealth equals money zen. And to me, that endpoint money zen that means that you have calm and confidence and clarity around the role that money plays in your life and your relationship with money. And so the first two steps are understanding what is financial health, how do you think about it, and what is emotional wealth, because you have two key limited resources, time and money. And just like we asset allocate in our portfolios between, stocks and bonds, we do the same with financial health and emotional wealth. And, our asset allocation isn't the same for the entirety of our life, and neither is our emphasis on each side. But understanding those broad asset categories is the essential step out of the cult of never enough.
And let's break that down a little bit further if you're up for that. Tell us about your, key aspects of financial health. How do you think about what financial health means?
I briefly define financial health as the ability to meet your current obligations without stress, to know that you have enough set aside, because the one thing we can expect is the unexpected, and that the game plan you have for the money you are putting towards the future is something that you are comfortable with, whether that future is retirement or whether that future is being able to start your own business or send your kids to school. Now, in that definition, there's no number. People will often come back to me and say, well, yeah, Manisha, it's really easy for you to talk about that because you spent your life in financial services. I've been a teacher and I don't get paid nearly what I should relative to the value I add to community, which I know firsthand because my mom is a teacher. And
my sister's a teacher. So I agreed with your thoughts on that as well.
So how am I supposed to achieve financial health? And there are two pieces to this. One is understanding the basics of good financial hygiene, budgeting, debt management, cash flow. But the other piece that I feel is equally, or if not more important, is understanding a phrase you used earlier, which is counterfeit financial culture. So identifying what your current needs are, the ones that you can meet easily, that's the cornerstone of financial health. Yet for so many of us, our definition of what our needs are constantly are growing bigger.
Right.
And oftentimes we don't realize why. And I'm going to give an example. So in TV shows and movies, I see this routinely. If you look at a character, and I'm just going to take the TV show Suits because it happens to be trending on Netflix right now. It's a legal drama, and one of the main characters is a woman named Donna, who is an executive assistant in the early stages of the show. And Donna lives in a humid city, yet every morning she goes into work and there's no frizz in her hair, which means she just had a $50 fresh blowout. Her nails are exquisite despite the fact that she's on the computer every day. So we know she's getting fresh mani-pedis. Her clothes, you can literally see the quality of the fabric screaming through the screen, and they're perfectly tailored. And then you look at, her $15 Cosmopolitans that she's having after work with friends, where she lives, what she drives. So I went to look, what is the average income for someone in this profession in a large metropolitan area? And then I added up what it would cost to look, groom, and live like this character. And you'd have to earn 30 to 50% more. And I encourage people to do this on every character you see in, you don't need to add it all up, but just be aware and ask. I was watching season 6 of SWAT, and they have one of the core characters, Hondo, who I adore. He lives in South Central LA. Well, let me just tell you, I did a summer internship in South Central LA, and the house he is portrayed as living in is not existing in South Central LA, sadly.
Right. Yeah.
And so, again, we're getting this images of a police person living a lifestyle that in LA would probably require twice as much as the income. And so when I talk about this root of financial health, it is understanding what living within your means for the income that you have coming in,
right,
and not having it distorted by seeing images of other people doing the same career you are in the media, but living a much grander life.
Right. Yeah. There's the unhealthy aspects of counterfeit financial culture everywhere. And the other opposite extreme is like extreme frugality. You get into the FIRE movement. And it was interesting. It comes up earlier in the book, not specifically as FIRE, but you mentioned your plan was to save all your money and retire. And I was like, oh, I have to ask Manisha about her thoughts on FIRE. And then it comes back in the book where you dive a little bit, further into it, where there's this, and it kind of blew up, I think, over COVID, where it just seemed to turn into this, overdone exercise and not working and not doing anything, right? Where I'm going to save all my money so I can quit my job and not have to work. Well, that other example doesn't seem real healthy either. Right? Where we're moving away from something with no path forward. It's just, there's lots of different ways that this culture, you can get inundated with these ideas and these, quote unquote movements take hold. And all of a sudden it's everywhere. You feel like you're not saving and investing. And the fact that you want to continue to work is somehow outside the norm all of a sudden.
There are two books that I read in the early 90s when I was in my early 20s that changed the course of my life. One is Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own. And the other is Vicki Robin and Joe Dominguez's book, Your Money or Your Life, which is essentially the Bible of the FIRE movement. And I've been very lucky over the years to get to know Vicki. And I'll circle back around to that. But I read that book the year it came out, 1992. And I fell in love with this notion of the crossover point, of this idea that you could get to a level where your investment base was large enough that you could live off your income so you did not have to work. But the way in which Vicki and Joe were positioning this was not to encourage us all to try and become millionaires. They were talking about living lightly, being so clear on what is the minimal level of how simple could you make your life? And so the crossover point would be way lower than what any of us would have imagined. And so, she's talking about being able to, live back then, and obviously this would be inflation adjusted, but on $30,000 a year for an individual, which I guess maybe now might be $50,000 a year. And so the idea was never to deny to become rich and then live this super rich life. And I loved that idea of finding the crossover point from living a very simple life. But then what happened was all of these societal influences, the industry I happen to be in and its incredible emphasis on money because it's financial services, and the expectations of what that minimal standard was started to grow such that then the crossover point
right.
bigger and bigger and bigger, and there was never enough money. You never reached the crossover point.
Right.
And one of the things Vicki told me was that when she did the second edition of the book, I think it was 2018 or 19 when it came out, she was fascinated by the FIRE movement. And she got to know people. The thing that worried her the most was that people had turned it almost into a competition and a level of denial that was so extreme, it disconnected them from community and connection, which was a huge part of the original vision.
Right. And it seems to me too that the people that I talk to that are down, let's call it a fire path, where they're trying to get to a point where they're financially independent, but they're moving towards something really meaningful to them. They want to, kind of scale back their hours so they can take care of their parents, or they're kind of anticipating the future in that way, or, they want to open a sandwich shop, and that brings them a lot of joy to kind of follow their passion for baking, whatever the case might be. These are really highly self-actualized people. They've really got, I think maybe this is a good segue into the emotional wealth aspect of the equation, but there are still a lot of people. I think there's a healthy way to go about achieving financial independence and focusing on what's important to you. But, you do a good job of describing how, sometimes our good ideas get corrupted by our society over time, right? And it gets askew from the original intent altogether.
I mean, I can just give you a basic example. We're talking now, and I'm in Maine. And as I went through the Money's End process, one of the things that I identified was that I really wanted to connect more with my family. And my brother has 3 young children, and I wanted to spend as much time with them as possible before they hated being around grownups. And so I decided that I wanted to buy a simple little cabin in Maine, and it's a summer cabin, seasonal. And so I live there 5-6 months out of the year. It's 550 square feet, doesn't have potable water. I have to bring in water. I don't have a washer or dryer. So I wash my clothes by hand and I hang them up on the clothesline. And I spent 2 summers and I loved it. And then my neighbors 2 doors down, yes, they remodeled and expanded. And suddenly in my mind, I'm like, you know what? Maybe I really
potable
could
water sounds interesting.
Yeah. And then the next thing I knew, the first summer, if you can just visualize this, I had a mattress on the floor, 1 chair, like a side chair that was comfortable, and a side table. And that was it. That was all I had in the place. And I had my kayak and my paddle boards, but I was completely happy without any furniture. And I didn't have a closet, so I had a few pieces of clothes folded up. And, little by little, now I have a bed and a sofa and 2 side chairs. And, it sneaks up on us, even when the underlying intention, in my case, was to enhance my emotional wealth by spending more time with family. And so that's why this is so hard to balance, is because often the activities we identify around emotional wealth can get co-opted by the forces we talked before, and they can hurt our financial health.
Right. So we always need to be checking in on what's important here. What was the mission? What was going to make me happy and be meaningful in my life, or how I'm behaving, how I'm spending, the lifestyle that I'm creeping into. Is it aligned with that original goal? Is always worth it. You talked about in emotional wealth, you got into creativity. So I don't know if this is a bit of a left turn, but you're the second person this week in a podcast conversation that has started talking about creativity. When we originally opened the conversation talking about, in our case, emotional wealth, but in the past conversation, it was purpose and meaning, and trying to fulfill or live a meaningful life. And creativity has come up and seems to come up more and more as being a critical aspect to being on that journey. Can you share some thoughts about that for us?
Yeah, I have come to believe there are 3 C's that are superpowers. The first is curiosity, the second is connection, and then the third is creativity. And I believe that the first 2 open up to the third. And one of the things that makes humans go into flow is when you are in a creative state and you lose track of time. And I mean, it could be everything from scrapbooking to figuring out how to put French braids in your daughter's hair. There are all different forms of creativity. Maybe it's spending time in your garage and rebuilding your bike and bicycle. And so I find that creativity is a state of being that generally is exhibited by a state of that flow state where we lose track of time because we're so present. And when we are running around like human doings and not allowing ourselves to experience life as a human being, we do not have the mental bandwidth to allow that creativity to bubble up, let alone act on it. And, they say, you get a great idea in the shower. Well, yeah, you do, because for so many people, that's the only space that they have.
The only quiet time.
Right, yeah. Right. So creativity is huge.
I've never considered myself a creative person. And, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot and how it was described to me, I happen to be talking to a life coach in this last conversation, but it doesn't have to be a masterpiece painting that you suddenly find yourself being able to create. It could be as simple as digging in the garden. You mentioned, fixing your bike, just having a thing and giving yourself space for that thing, whatever it is a really useful tool to expanding that emotional wealth as part of the equation, as you've laid it out. And it comes up as kind of this interesting recurring theme recently as I've explored some of these things. So I appreciate you illuminating that. Before I let you go, we're kind of getting up against the hour or so. We've talked about financial health. We've talked a little bit about emotional wealth equals money zen. And there's a lot to explore there. At the end of the book, you talk about joyful spending, which I think is a really great concept for people to be aware of, because it's really, how do I control my behavior? How do I reframe my mindset on spending? Can you tell us a little bit about how you think through joyful spending and what that means?
Absolutely. So early on in my career, I used to talk about budgeting, and people hate the B word. So I was trying to think, how can I help people learn to live within their means in a way that doesn't feel constricted? And there are 3 tools to joy-based spending. And the big overarching goal of joy-based spending is to squeeze as much happiness out of each dollar that you spend. And step 1 is doing a joy audit, writing down what you spend money on, ideally for a month. But, if all you can do is a week or a weekend, start there. When you're done, you don't add it up. You just take out a highlighter and you highlight anything you spent money on that didn't bring you joy. And there's the usual stuff like utilities and so forth. That's not what I'm talking about, but highlight those because you can, there are things you can do to help bring those down. But it's things like soccer lessons for the kids, where the kids hate the coach and you hate driving them there, or going out to dinner with a couple who drinks wine and loves to buy very expensive wine, and you just prefer a Budweiser, and the bill comes and you split it and you're like, and then sometimes it's really big things, like you're an empty nester and you're looking at your mortgage and you're like, there are more bathrooms in this house than people. Why am I, why do we have so much home? And so the joy audit helps you identify leaky money. The next step is the hourly wage tool, where, and this is inspired by Vicki Robin, where, it's this notion that most of us have money coming in our life because either we work for it or someone in our lives worked for it. And so when we spend the money, we're spending our life's energy.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah. It's very powerful. And so most of us work or do work-related activities about 2,000 hours a year. So if you're earning $80,000, $100,000, let's use 100, keep math simple, divided by 2,000 hours, you're earning $50 an hour before tax. Now, if you see some fancy electronic gizmo that costs $500, you can do the math and say, is this worth 10 hours or more than 10 hours of my life's energy or not? And there's not a right or wrong answer to that, but it gives you a ruler of your life's energy to measure. And then go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. No, you go.
I was going to say the last piece is the power of the pause. Everything in our society is set to push us to make fast decisions. And, if it's online shopping and it's not an absolute necessity that you need right away, challenge yourself to keep things in your checkout cart for a week and then go back and see from a calmer frame of mind how much you actually end up buying. And if it's in a physical store, take a photograph and challenge yourself to sit with it for a week before going ahead and purchasing in the overarching construct of joy-based spending. And when you identify leaky spending, you can then redirect that either into more things that bring you emotional wealth, invest in that bucket, or things that can shore up your financial health.
Right. And I was just going to jump back to the hourly wage test. And I think you alluded to this. There's no right or wrong answer, is there? And sometimes you mentioned this in the book, and I thought it was fantastic. Sometimes the $7 latte is worth it and brings a lot of joy. And I've mentioned this in other conversations on the podcast, and I feel like I talk about the latte all the time. But if you're a working mother, let's say, and that latte gets you out of the house and connects you with a friend, and you do that every once in a while, and you're spending $50 a month on coffee, that's okay. Right? If that's meaningful and you've thought about it and it was mindful and it brings you joy. So I think that framework is a great way of going about figuring out what's important to you and therefore where you should be spending your money.
Yeah, the latte gets beaten up all the time. So I want to echo that. I love to write and work in coffee houses. And so I'll get a cappuccino and I will sit there sometimes for 2 hours doing my work. So my, hourly spending is $3.50 and my joy is priceless from that latte. And so that's the power of joy-based spending is no one is telling you, you can't do that. You get to decide.
Yeah, it's great. So before I let you go, is there anything else you wanted to share with us? Did we cover, at least give people a good introduction of Money Zen? Again, financial health plus emotional wealth equals Money Zen. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we let you go today?
Just one last concept, and that's permission to achieve less. I have found that often is the key to unlocking the space to enable you to identify the steps to shore up your financial health and what truly brings you emotional wealth. And when I first came across the phrase achieve less, I literally wanted to dry heave. I'm thinking like, I can't do that. Every ounce
visceral reaction to that, right?
It really was. And what I've come to learn is that giving myself permission to achieve less doesn't mean I'm a sloth that lives on the couch all day eating brownies and watching Netflix. It means that I am making smart decisions about how I allocate my time. And I am saying no to many more things so that I can say yes to the things where I can maximize my creativity, my connection, my curiosity. And oftentimes when you do those things, they lead to either more emotional wealth or help your finances. And so I just encourage people, because society doesn't encourage us to do it, to give yourself permission to achieve less, and less can be defined however you want it to be defined.
It's great. So you heard it here. If this conversation is landing with you, financial wellness expert Manisha Thakor just gave you permission to chill out and achieve a little bit less. It's okay. And in fact, it's encouraged if you want to explore some of this, deeper emotional wealth. It gives you the space to do it. So it's a great place to wrap up. One last question. This is a podcast about financial well-being and well-being in general. Given our conversation, I assume you have some things that you like to get to that bring you joy, get you centered, habits, rituals, routines, things that, help you build that emotional wealth. Would you mind sharing some of the things that you find you get back to really explore your emotional well-being?
Sure. I'll give 3 examples. The first is back when I was in my 20s, I had spent my junior year of college at Oxford. On the way back, I was sketching out kind of Carl Richards style, a drawing on a cocktail napkin of how I wanted to live my life. What were the guiding principles? And it was an equilateral triangle. And at the top, I wrote simplicity. In the lower left-hand corner, I wrote small joys. In the lower right-hand corner, I wrote financial independence. And what happened in my case was the triangle tipped and financial independence became the root of everything. And I lost simplicity and small joys in my life. So my new overarching framework is really trying to identify opportunities to experience simplicity and small joys. So one example is there's a woman named Julia Cameron. Many people may have heard of her in the spiritual community. She has a wonderful book called The Artist's Way at Work. And one of the exercises she recommends doing each morning is something called morning pages. It's 3 pages of stream of conscious writing. And when you're done, you tear it up. So it's not like a diary, and you write whatever comes into your mind. And I consider it clearing the pond scum of my mind. And now when I wake up, the thing that gets me out of bed is I get to go do my morning pages, and I have a whole ritual, light a candle, cool. Make my coffee. And then another thing that I find always takes me out of myself. I don't have children. And so spending time with my nephews and my niece doing anything brings me exquisite joy. So those are, and the last one I'll throw out is being in nature. I find anytime I can breathe fresh air, get a little sunlight, we spend so much time indoors in modern life, and being able to just walk outside just feels like such a treat.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing. That's great. All great advice. It's been a pleasure. Again, it's not just because you're in front of me. We're having this conversation right now. I think the topic that you tackle is, if not the most important, one of the most important topics for us all to consider when we're thinking about our wealth and wellness and who we are and living in today's society. So it's been, again, a pleasure to talk to you. Manisha Thakor, the book is Money Zen: The Secret to Finding Your Enough. Where should people check you out? Websites, socials? Is there anything you want to spotlight or direct people to?
I like to keep things simple. So my entire professional life is at moneyzen.com. You can find all of the above there. And you can also find a guided, free, downloadable guided journal that you can use as you're going through the book to help make some notes. And it asks lots of questions to help further your exploration.
Yeah, I encourage people to check that out. There's a lot of great stuff there to go along with the book. I encourage people to check it out. I think this is going to be one of the client gifts or book that we give out as a firm and as an advisor most often moving forward, because it does a great job of just kind of summarizing all these big concepts and conversations. So thank you again. Thanks everybody for listening. This is Modern Financial Wellness. You can check us out at modernfinancialwellness.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. The video will be up on YouTube. And thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.